Welcome back to the Dreaming and Doing podcast. I am here today with Michaela Langley, who is a licensed graduate professional counselor at LifeSpring Counseling Services in Maryland. Welcome, Michaela.
Hi, Melissa. So good to be here.
Yeah, so today, Michaela, I know that the topic we're going to be talking about is one that is really interesting to a lot of people, but it's also a topic that's really difficult for people. So today we are going to be talking about achieving your goals by having healthy boundaries. So tell me, what do you think makes it so hard for people to set healthy boundaries?
Yeah. I think what I've noticed in talking with people about what makes boundary setting so hard is a couple different things. One thing that I think people struggle with sometimes is this sense of guilt when we set a boundary with somebody because we don't always get the best reaction from people and then we feel like we did something wrong. So that can be a barrier sometimes, this sense of like unearned guilt that's maybe not needed in that moment. And I also will hear a little bit about how people feel like boundaries are mean or wrong or not very nice. And that can be a barrier sometimes. But I think when we're working through that, it's really important to think of boundaries as something that are actually super essential to preserving our relationships with people, really essential to meeting our goals, really essential to meeting our dreams. And living life without boundaries could actually be a lot more detrimental than when we put boundaries in place. It can make our life a lot easier, it can make our relationships a lot easier, and just kind of keep a sense of peace for you and the people around you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that a lot of people think that if they set boundaries, then that means that they are mean. And I hear similar variations of that. And so, how do you respond when people communicate that belief that it's wrong of me to set a boundary, or that means I'm being mean if I set a boundary?
Yeah, I think it's kind of important to acknowledge where that comes from. I think in a lot of ways, we're really socialized to think that like saying no is mean, setting boundaries with other people are mean. But if we can reframe that, I think that's a really good first step. So understanding that setting boundaries aren't mean, instead, they're self care. Setting boundaries aren't mean, they're kind, right? And Melissa Urban, the co founder of Whole30, wrote a book called I can't remember what it's called. I'll let you know later and we can add it to the show notes. But she wrote a book on boundary setting. And one of the phrases in her book that really resonates and I think can be really helpful for people to remember is that boundaries are kind. And they are kind because when we don't have boundaries, what we can notice sometimes is resentment might build in our relationships. We start to feel avoidant of relationships. We start to worry and have more anxiety in our relationships. And it ends up deteriorating the relationship. Where if we are able to implement some healthy boundaries even earlier on, we can prevent that from happening. And you have healthier relationships with the people around you and more satisfying relationships with the people around you. And the people around you kind of have some guidelines on how to behave in your relationships and how to have a good relationship with you.
Yeah. Now, I think that there are times where we are the ones who might need to initiate or establish a boundary, right? And I think in those cases where someone knows that they have to do that, that's when they're like, oh, that feels harsh or that feels mean. But I think that there are other occasions where sometimes we are put in awkward situations because some other person has violated one of our boundaries. And now we are in a position of needing to communicate that you have crossed the line. So we need to establish a boundary because someone has violated one. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on handling those situations where someone feels like you put me in a spot, you put me in a position, and I don't know, I feel awkward for being here, but also I feel like I need to do something. But do I do something? How do you support people in those situations?
Yeah, I think we absolutely do something. Because if we don't do anything, we're just communicating that our boundaries aren't super important and you can kind of push through them and it's not really a big deal and we're not really going to say anything about it. And then we're back where we were dealing with resentment and anxiety and avoidance, right? But I do think you're right. I think it's really common where we have the best of intentions, we set a boundary, we do a great job setting our boundary, and then it doesn't quite get respected, right? And that's really common. So I think it's okay and normal to expect that sometimes when we set a boundary, you're going to have to restate your boundary. And we don't have to be mean when we restate our boundary. We can be really kind when we restate our boundary. But I think it's important. One of the most important parts is to restate your boundary, right? So that might look like saying, oh, hey, wait a second. You're talking about that thing that I mentioned that I don't want to talk about. And we can stop it right there. And sometimes that's the only cue that people need to remember, oh, wait, this was a boundary that I'm not supposed to cross. And this person really does mean that because I just crossed it and they're reminding me, right? And that's not mean. That's just a reminder. I think going in it with the best of assuming the best of intentions of the person that you're talking to is really important too. Like sometimes maybe they just forgot, right? And that happens. And then another really important part, I think, to bring up when we're talking about boundaries is when we set a boundary, I think we have to be pretty mindful in the back of our head of like, okay, worst case scenario, they don't respect my boundary. What am I realistically willing to do to enforce my boundary if I need to? So, does that mean I'm willing to remove myself from the conversation? Does that mean I'm willing to physically walk away if this boundary gets crossed that many times? Does that mean I'm willing to quit my job or take a break from this relationship? But I think it's important to identify that so that you are able to enforce your boundary if you need to. And I think it's really important to not communicate a consequence that you're not actually prepared to enforce, but also going into it with the mindset that we don't necessarily need to say that the first
Yes,
time we set a
I
boundary.
love that, right? Like, don't say something if you don't mean it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Like, I'm thinking about parents. If you do that one more time, you're grounded for a life. Well, like, yeah, really?
Yeah. Probably not. Probably not. So I think it's important to only say things that we actually have like in our mind. Yep. I could enforce that. I would be comfortable enforcing that, and I'm willing to enforce that.
Yes. So, as you were talking earlier, I'm like thinking of people that I've spoken to before who might say, but I shouldn't need to tell someone again. I shouldn't need to tell them again about my boundary. What would you say to that?
Well, when we are communicating boundaries, especially new boundaries that are something that maybe that other person is not used to hearing from us, I think it's important to have a little bit of grace for that other person, because in the same way that the boundary maybe is a change in behavior for us, we're kind of maybe asking that person to change their behavior around us a little bit too. So it's something that sometimes both parties have to get used to, and that takes a little bit of trial and error.
Yeah. And it's reminding me of the other part, right? Is where when we're setting a new boundary with somebody else and we are wanting and expecting them to abide by that, I sometimes find that maybe it's also difficult for us to follow our own boundary that we've established with someone. So if someone finds that I'm trying to establish a boundary with someone else, but like I'm having a hard time upholding it on my end, what advice would you give for that
Yeah.
person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to remember, especially when we're setting up new boundaries, that, boundaries can be flexible. So we're setting up a boundary right now for our current situation, but we're kind of testing it out too. And maybe we get into this situation, we're like, actually, this doesn't really fit. Maybe I need to change my boundary a little bit, right? As circumstances change, I think our boundaries can change. As the context changes, I think our boundaries can change. So we can be flexible.
All right. So that's good to know, right? Because sometimes maybe we can be overly rigid. Sometimes maybe we're not firm enough, but knowing that we can have some fluidity there too, as we need.
Right, exactly. I think that's really important to remember with boundaries. And that can make them a little bit less intimidating too. Once we set one, it's not like, this is it. This is the only boundary I'm going to have in this situation for the rest of all time. This is set in stone. It's not, right? There's some flexibility. Maybe you set a boundary with somebody and they're doing a really good job of respecting it, so we can tweak it a little bit.
Yes. So, Michaela, I'm wondering, I know one of the things that you've been reflecting on is what is the role that boundaries play in achieving our goals, pursuing our dreams. So talk with us a little bit about how boundaries fit in there.
Yeah. I think a lot of the time when we are thinking about boundaries, we often think about them in relationships or in comparison or in relationship with other people. So like, do I need to set a boundary in this relationship with somebody else? Or we tend to think about boundaries as relational. But I think boundaries are also really important to have with ourselves, and we need self boundaries. And sometimes that looks like figuring out like, okay, what are my goals in life? What do I want to achieve today? Or am I getting in my own way in any kind of ways? Like, am I waking up in the morning and I've been really saying I want to wake up in the morning and I want to exercise 3 out of 5 days this work week. But I'm waking up in the morning and the first thing I do is I pull out my phone and I lose an hour scrolling social media in the morning, and I've lost the time that I set aside to work out, and that didn't work out for me, right? So that's a good time when maybe we need to take a second and kind of reflect on our own habits and see if there's some boundaries we need to set with ourselves so we can kind of achieve our goals, right? Whether it's setting up some new habits, whether it's holding ourselves accountable for maybe ways that we're not making the best use of our time. I think there's a lot of ways that boundaries can be applied to ourselves that can really help us achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves.
Yes. And I'm thinking, well, exercise was one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking, right? How many times have we said, this is a goal that I have? As a therapist, we always talk about like walking the walk, modeling behavior, right? But how do we hold ourselves accountable to a goal like exercise or self-care? And I'm thinking about people who work in universities and have to do research or they have to do writing. And sometimes the challenge is carving out time to do the research, time to do the writing, and keeping that time boundary for themselves. And in my experience, sometimes boundaries that we set for ourselves, we're sometimes quick to dismiss them and be like, oh, whatever, it's just me, right? So it doesn't really matter, right? Like it's just my exercise, okay, I didn't get my writing time in today. It's fine. It was just an appointment with myself. And sometimes even the way that we talk to ourselves, it's me. I'm allowed to talk to myself that way. So for people who are maybe wanting to set a boundary with themselves, but who are also quick to dismiss the boundary with themselves, what support or encouragement would you give them?
I think I love, love, love that you brought up self talk because I think it's vital. And I so much love to encourage people to show up in their own lives and be an active participant in their own lives because if not you, then who, right? So the self talk that you tell yourself really does matter. It influences what you'll end up doing, your actions, your behaviors, how you're feeling. Those things really matter.
Yes. So, what are some tips that you would offer for people who are like, I don't know the first thing about setting healthy boundaries? What are some tips that you would offer?
Yeah. I think well, first of all, we have to figure out if we need a boundary, right? So some warning signs that maybe you might need a boundary is those things that we mentioned a little bit earlier, like, oh, I'm starting to feel really anxious, really avoidant, maybe resentful, but angry, burnt out. Burnout's a good one, an important one to mention, right? So if we're feeling those things, it's probably a sign that we need to be thinking about setting a boundary. And then the next tip that I would say is really important is getting really clear with what our boundary is, right? So, like when we're communicating boundaries with other people, we have to be really clear and really direct. So that's not like maybe an eye roll or like a sigh here and there, and then being like, yeah, that they can tell. They can tell that I'm upset and this is a boundary cross, right? But they can't. We have to be really clear and really direct in communicating what we're looking for from people so that they know. So I think being really clear, noticing when we need a boundary, and then also being really mindful of reminding people of our boundaries when we have boundary violations. That's probably top 3 tips.